Lawyers have read it. What is a detail that your client failed to bring up to you that completely lost you the case? Story 1. Our client was a home health care worker who provided in-home assistance to elderly and homebound individuals. One of her clients, a gentleman she'd cared for over the course of about a year, passed away and, to everyone's surprise, left his entire estate to her. Predictably, the deceased's surviving relatives were not pleased. The only family he had was a great niece who lived several states away and hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. Nevertheless, she decided to sue our client for undue influence and similar claims. From our client's account, she and the man had developed a strong, genuine bond. She even left her job to care for him full-time. They took small trips together, spent nearly every day in each other's company, and she was, by all appearances, the only consistent support he had in his final years. We truly believe this was a case of someone showing appreciation for the person who was there for him when no one else was. We knew the family would try to paint her as a manipulative gold digger. One piece of evidence they latched onto was a joking email she sent the deceased during the estate planning phase, where she quipped, "We should just get married and skip all this paperwork." Not the best look, especially in hindsight. So we stressed to her that the opposition would absolutely use this to build a narrative. We needed her to be solid, calm, and consistent during deposition. We prepped her thoroughly. Days of review, mock depositions, every possible line of questioning drilled over and over. She was eccentric, to put it mildly, and had a tendency to be aggressive. So we really went above and beyond to get her deposition ready. Then came the actual deposition. In the first 10 minutes, she's asked about her marital history. We already knew she'd been married 3 times. What we didn't know, because she never once mentioned it, is that she'd also been engaged 11 times, and then she casually explains that she always called off the engagements because the men didn't make enough money to support her lifestyle. From there it just got worse. When asked if she had any criminal history, she replied that she had never been arrested, but then added that she had spent 2 weeks in jail for contempt of court after refusing to obey a judge's order and hiding evidence during a past lawsuit. She then spent the next 2 full days of deposition, a grueling 16 hours total, swinging between saying she couldn't remember simple things like her phone number and insulting opposing counsel, calling him names right to his face. We pulled her aside on every break, tried to reel her in, reminded her of everything we'd prepared, but nothing worked. Finally, during one break, I happened to be in the restroom at the same time as her and saw her pull out a handful of pills. When I asked what they were, she casually said they were for her anxiety. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I once represented a guy who was fighting a domestic violence restraining order. He wasn't a terrible person, more like your typical small-town guy with a drinking problem and a tendency to run his mouth when intoxicated. The incident in question involved a heated argument with his ex, who had a known history of drug abuse and was clearly using the restraining order as an opening move in a nasty custody battle. He insisted the altercation was only verbal and that she was the one who got physical, but he never hit her. Honestly, based on her reputation and the details he gave me, I believed him. But there was one big issue. The judge had a police report detailing my client being belligerent and intoxicated that night. He was charged with resisting arrest and assault on a law enforcement officer, though in reality, he just mouthed off to the cop and ended up on the wrong end of that encounter. Court day comes. The ex shows up with her new boyfriend, and both look like they haven't slept or showered in days. It's obvious they're still under the influence of something, and the judge definitely picks up on it. Meanwhile, my client shows up clean-shaven, dressed like he's headed to church, saying, "Yes, Your Honor," like we rehearsed. The ex immediately breaks down in tears, trying to get the judge to listen to voicemails on her phone. He waves her off and starts the testimony. Her story is all over the place. She claims my client threatened to off her in front of everyone, then completely fails to name a single witness. I'm thinking, wow, she's not just nervous, she's still high. When I get to cross, I start acting polite and confused, just trying to understand her version of events. I ask her, "You said he threatened you in front of everyone who was there," she replied, nervously. Bobby? No, wait, Shonda? Just one name would really help here," I said. She perked up and replied, "My best friend in the whole world. She was there." That sounded promising, so I asked. Great, what's her name? Jennifer, she said confidently. She lives next door. I nodded, playing along. Okay, and what's Jennifer's last name? There was a long pause. She blinked, looked around, and finally muttered, I don't know. I looked at her, trying not to react too much, and asked, so you don't know your best friend in the whole world's last name? The judge groans and cuts it off right there. Then it's my client's turn. He owns up to drinking too much, admits he got mouthy with the cop, regrets his behavior but swears he never touched her, explains the stress of the custody battle, sounds honest, composed. We're still uphill because of the police report, but the judge is clearly thinking things over. Then the ex suddenly finds her energy and begs the judge to listen to a voicemail. The judge approves of it. I turn to my client. His face just drops. He sinks down in his chair. Judge hits play. Voicemail starts. Message 1. You filthy lying piece of trash. I swear I said I'm gonna do things to you you sep never felt before, and you sep wish you never crossed me. Judge slams the gavel. Injunction granted. Bailiff, call the next case. All that prep, all that hope, and he never mentioned the voicemails. Story 3. This wasn't my client, but rather the son of the opposing party, who along with his father apparently decided to fake being blind to make himself seem more sympathetic on the stand. We had no idea about this stunt until he took the witness box. Their counsel handed him the oath card and asked him to read it out loud, and the guy just picked it up and read it perfectly. It had already been a train wreck of a case on their side, and this was just the cherry on top. The judge dismissed the case entirely in our client's favor. Not long after that. At the time I was still a trainee, but even my supervising attorney, who was in her 60s and had seen everything, told me it was the most absurd case she'd ever handled. Story 4. I was the victim of a hit and run and ended up with a badly injured leg. Thankfully, they caught the guy, who turned out to be a wealthy kid driving his mom's convertible Porsche. He denied everything, claimed he had no idea he'd hit me. At the trial, the prosecutor asked him how long he had been driving, to which he answered, "Do you mean how long have I been driving legally or illegally?" The judge immediately jumped on it, demanding to know what he meant by illegally and when that started. His defense team sat down in their chairs and shook their heads. Needless to say, he lost the case. What's even more bizarre is, the same guy died in a boating accident. He had rented a speedboat while on vacation, ended up flipping it, and drowned. Reports later said he had been drinking. Story 5. A friend of mine is a lawyer, and he once represented a guy charged with burglary. The case was already shaky, and they were hoping to challenge the evidence presented. On the day of the hearing, the client walks into court wearing a hoodie and jeans. Nothing unusual at first glance, but when the prosecution pulled up the CCTV footage from the night of the crime, it showed the burglar wearing the exact same outfit. As soon as the video started playing, the room went silent. The client glanced at the screen, then looked down at himself, realizing what he'd done. He leaned over and whispered, "Oh crap." Needless to say, things went downhill from there. Story 6. Not a lawyer yet, but I clerked for a DDOT as office all throughout law school. Since we didn't have clients, I can't speak from that angle, but this one case stuck with me. It was a kidnapping trial involving two Asian male defendants, both the same age and with very similar appearances. During the trial, the victim takes the stand and is asked to identify which of the two defendants had shoved a Uzi in his face. You could tell the witness was struggling to tell them apart. Understandable, given the similarities. Then, in what can only be described as an all-time moment of courtroom self-destruction, one of the defendants raises his hand and gestures at himself like, "Right here, bud." The entire courtroom just kind of froze. Hands down the dumbest thing I'd ever seen. I thought his defense attorney was going to have a brain aneurysm. Story 7. I'm a lawyer, but in this particular case, I was just observing the trial, not directly involved. Still, it left a lasting impression. The case involved woman A, who was accused of hitting woman B in the head with a heavy beer pint at a bar, causing some pretty serious injuries. The defense's whole argument was that woman A hadn't intentionally hit anyone. She had just tossed the glass in a random direction and had accidentally hit woman B, so they claimed that I was just an unfortunate accident. Well, then the prosecution rolls out the CCTV footage from the bar. It shows woman A calmly walking up behind woman B and smashing the pint glass over her head with full force. The glass literally shatters on impact. You could feel the entire courtroom shift. I glanced over at the defense lawyer, and I swear his jaw almost hit the table. The prosecutor, clearly picking up on the moment, just asked, "Thrown, eh?" The defense lawyer, looking like he wanted to disappear, muttered that he hadn't been able to review the tape due to technical difficulties on his computer. Unsurprisingly, woman A was found guilty. I was dumbfounded at how the defense didn't see that coming. Story 8. I'm a public defender in an area with a pretty serious drug problem. And if there's one thing meth does, it makes people talk a lot. I've lost count of how many times a client has conveniently forgotten to mention that they showed up to jail still high and immediately hopped on the recorded jail phone to not only confess to the crime, but also workshop an alibi, often the very same alibi I'm about to present in court. Those phone calls are always recorded, and somehow that's the one thing they never seem to remember. And this isn't limited to my cases either. Back when I was in school, I was sitting in court for a journalism project and saw a perfect example of this. A woman had been arrested for drug possession when she came to bail out her boyfriend. Turns out her boyfriend had called her from jail and, using the recorded jail phone, told her to bring some weed and crack with her when she came to bail him out. A guard overheard it. It was all on tape, and when she showed up, they arrested her on the spot. Story 9. This one's from my time working as a paralegal. We had a negligence case where our client claimed he crashed into a utility pole because the street was poorly lit and a cyclist appeared out of nowhere, causing him to swerve. His whole argument was based on visibility issues and unexpected obstacles. Upon discovery, the first responders' report noted that when they arrived on the scene, the driver, our client, was still in the driver's seat with his pants down and smut playing on his phone. The whole dangerous road conditions angle kind of fell apart after that. It didn't take long to figure out who was really at fault. Story 10. This happened to me personally. I was helping my husband appeal his denial for unemployment benefits after he lost his job in the title mortgage industry. I asked him multiple times before the hearing, "Are you sure you didn't do anything that got you fired?" Every time he insisted he had done nothing wrong, that the company just let him go out of nowhere. Fast forward to the appeal hearing. Under oath, he confidently testifies that he was a model employee with no misconduct whatsoever. Then, during cross-examination, the opposing attorney casually pulls out documents from one of his real estate closings, documents that he had forged and backdated. He had just perjured himself, and our appeal was dead in the water. Not only did he lose the case, but he definitely didn't sleep at home that night. On a related note, a friend of mine went through something just as maddening. Her husband worked as a technician. Among other things, he repaired and installed elevators. One day, a customer sues him, claiming he destroyed their elevator. He denies it, furious but supportive. My friend helps prep his defense with his lawyer, going over all the documents and evidence. But something feels off. She keeps asking him, "Just tell me the truth. Did you do this?" And every time he flips out, accusing her of being unsupportive and disloyal. Then, just days before the trial, he finally comes clean. Turns out the customer had canceled their maintenance contract, and in a fit of revenge, he snuck into the building with a hammer after hours and wrecked the elevator. She was beyond pissed. She said if they didn't have kids together, she would have divorced him on the spot. Story 11. Not a lawyer yet, but I'm in law school and used to work for a defense attorney who handled a lot of federal cases. One case that still sticks with me involved a guy charged with migrating minors. When we first met him at the prison for the initial interview, he said he didn't know any of the girls, had nothing to do with any of it, and that this whole thing was a mistake. He swore up and down he was innocent. A few weeks later, we got the evidence packet from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it was stacked with dozens of pages of Snapchat messages and texts between him and the minors, video confessions from co-defendants and victims, naming him as the ringleader, receipts for motel room rentals, the whole 9 yards. We brought all of this to him during a follow-up meeting, and he insisted the co-defendants were just conspiring to pin everything on him. Still denied knowing anyone, despite overwhelming proof otherwise. Even with all that, he wanted to go to trial. We strongly advised against it, explaining just how airtight the case was. He filed to have us replaced, claiming we were ineffective as counsel. To this day, my old boss and I reminisce about how difficult this client was when we catch up on the phone. Story 12. My house got robbed, and besides all the usual stuff, the thief took a huge collection of my suits and neckties, like around 100 ties. But the thief left fingerprints on a plastic box where I kept spare change. 3 months later, the same guy gets caught robbing another house nearby. The detectives matched his prints to the ones from my place. At the thief's arraignment, I saw him walk in wearing one of my suits and a tie. I told the district attorney, but he said it'd be hard to prove. But the tie he wore was a one-of-a-kind street map of San Francisco. I still had all the paperwork to prove it was mine. When the DA saw that, his eyes went wide, and he told the judge. The judge immediately ordered the thief to be rearrested for possession of stolen property. The thief's lawyer was caught off guard. Story 13. I was dealing with a visitation and child support case with my ex over our 3-year-old. We both remarried, and the court order said he was supposed to pick up our kid from my house at 6 p.m. every other Friday. The problem was he'd often show up at 9 p.m. or later, sometimes not at all, without ever calling ahead. Keep in mind, this was before cell phones were common, but both of us actually had one, so there was a way to reach us. After one too many no-shows, my husband and I set up a video camera. Yeah, I know, but this was over 20 years ago. We positioned it to record our TV so you could see the evening news for a timestamp, our home phone to prove we weren't called, and our driveway to show if he showed up. We collected footage for about 6 months. When we finally went to court, my ex told his lawyer he was on time for every visit and that we were just blocking him from seeing his son. The judge asked us all to go into a private room with our lawyers to see if we could sort it out. Once there, the other lawyer started accusing us of lying and called us terrible names. My lawyer, who was 8 months pregnant with twins at the time, calmly pulled out the first of about 5 bags full of tapes showing all the visits he missed. She asked if the judge wanted to come watch the tapes with us. The ex and his lawyer asked us to leave so they could confer, but they were so loud the judge had to send someone in to quiet them down. We got everything we asked for, and I was very fair about it. Story 14. I had a coworker who survived a brain aneurysm, but ended up developing what felt like a split personality. He was warned by HR almost a dozen times for swearing at staff and sending abusive personal texts, but nothing stuck because he could always claim that work stress triggered his behavior. And honestly, that might have been true. Things got worse though. People were breaking down in the office, demanding that he be removed. Some even threatened to stop coming in because they didn't feel safe around him. Eventually, lawyers got involved. Then he crossed a serious line. He sent an email from his personal address to a colleague's company email address, saying he couldn't believe she betrayed him after all this time and didn't back him up, knowing his condition. They'd been good friends for quite a few years, and she did support him at work. He also mentioned he should have slept with her back in the day, as she's such a floozy, and he knows where she lives, so maybe he'll pop round one night and make it happen even if she didn't want it. Once HR and the lawyers saw that email, they said, "Yep, you can fire him now." He was out within 48 hours. Story 15. I sat in on a murder trial once. The case involved a homeless man who was picked up by the defendant, taken to the beach, and then offed. The defendant had a court-appointed attorney, and you could tell the odds weren't exactly in his favor from the start. There was already plenty of circumstantial evidence tying him to the crime. Surveillance video from a nearby gas station showed the guy's car parked right where the homeless man was known to hang out. So it looked bad, but there was no direct link between them before the trial. No motive, no relationship, that is until the defendant decided to testify. His lawyer begged him not to take the stand, but he went ahead anyway. The guy straight up admitted on the stand that he had let the homeless man crash on his couch once. His lawyer literally looked like he was going to pass out. Turns out the defendant only found out afterward that the man was a convicted SA offender, and he had a child living with him at the time. He said he felt betrayed and decided to handle it himself. Just like that, the prosecution had their motive. His own testimony gave them the premeditation they needed for a capital murder conviction. All the circumstantial evidence lined up after that. The whole courtroom went silent when he finished. You could see it on everyone's face. He thought he was explaining why he did it, but all he did was hand the jury the last piece of the puzzle. Story 16. So we had this case where our client was being sued for $50 million. It was a massive lawsuit. And honestly, the pressure was intense on all sides. After months of negotiations and back and forth, we finally got the opposing party to agree to settle for $20 million. Everyone involved saw this as a major win. We then spent weeks working out the details and drafting the settlement agreement. This wasn't just some casual handshake deal. The documents had to be signed in person, and timing was crucial. Both parties were scheduled to fly into our office on a Wednesday to sign everything. The timing was tied to the banks because the settlement funds had to be wired, while banks in two very different time zones were open at the same time. So everything was set up perfectly for this big moment. But then out of nowhere, on Tuesday, literally the day before signing, our client called us and told us the deal was off because the opposing party's loan to cover the settlement amount hadn't come through. What made it worse was that nobody had mentioned this loan to anyone, not to us, not to their lawyers, not to anyone involved in the negotiation. They had been hiding the fact that they were relying on a loan to pay the settlement. We were ready to close a huge deal, and it all collapsed because of a secret loan that didn't materialize. It was incredibly frustrating and honestly kind of unbelievable. Story 17. I'm not a lawyer, but I work with one. And this happened to a colleague's client. The client was on probation for a drug offense. Part of her probation was that she had to stay clean, and she knew it. To be clear, this wasn't a serious drug like meth or heroin, just weed. The lawyer told her multiple times, including just days before the hearing, that she would be tested at the courthouse and needed to be clean for at least a few days. The client swore up and down she was clean. Hearing day comes around. We're all in court waiting. When it's her turn, the judge asks her straight up, "Are you clean today?" She says yes. The judge says, "Okay, the bailiff will take you to get tested. Please wait here." Court goes on, but meanwhile the client, who definitely isn't clean, quietly slips out of the courthouse. The judge finds out she ditched her test and is furious. They catch her that afternoon, and she ends up testing positive. The judge is pissed and ready to throw the book at her. All she had to do was avoid smoking for a few days. She was almost done with probation, but instead she went to jail. Story 18. I'm a court-appointed attorney for low-income individuals dealing with family law matters. This particular case was about terminating parental rights, and for months I'd been building the argument that my client was finally stable, employed off psychotropic meds, had a suitable apartment, was ready to co-parent, the whole deal. We'd been negotiating with the Department of Children and Court Services, and while we weren't expecting to get her kids back at this pre-trial hearing, the goal was to show progress and stability to the guardians. I met with my client right before court and asked the standard question, "Has anything changed since our last meeting?" "Nope, all good. Let's get my kids," she said. Cool, I felt confident going in. Then we got into court and everything unraveled in under 15 seconds. My client, who has a history of being quick to anger, exploded in open court, screaming at the guardians, and in the middle of her outburst, she voluntarily reveals that she's no longer employed, no longer has an apartment, wants absolutely nothing to do with the guardians. Even though her kids love them, refuses to send the kids pictures of the toys they miss, plans to move out of state, intends to live off state aid once the kids are back. Oh, and she's 4 months pregnant. I just sat there, completely speechless. Months of work and carefully built credibility. Gone in seconds. Up until this point, she was doing the work. She had been checking every box and making genuine progress. Story 19. Not my personal case, but one my mentor told me about. This is the reason you never ask questions that you don't already know the answer to in court. During the trial, with the judge on a divorce matter, the wife brought up that he had abused her during their marriage. The client whispers to my mentor that that is not true. On the stand, during his portion of testimony, my mentor asks, "At any point in the marriage, did you lay your hands on your wife?" One time we were arguing, and I held her down on the couch until she stopped arguing with me. My mentor said it was like she could see it happening in slow motion, and all the alarm bells were going off in her head because he had never mentioned this, and apparently to him, this was not abuse. The judge awarded the wife significantly more in the settlement, and the husband sat there completely baffled about why things didn't go his way. My mentor was fuming. Story 20. Not my case, thank all the gods. It was a civil jury trial over injuries and property damage from a car accident. The plaintiff was also going after punitive damages because the defendant was intoxicated at the time of the crash. Now, anyone who's ever prepped a client for trial knows how the drill goes. The defense attorney would have asked the DUI dozens of times during prep, both for the deposition and the trial, about prior arrests, convictions, or anything that could blow up their testimony. The kind of stuff you have to disclose, so it doesn't become a courtroom grenade. DUI swears up and down, they've never been in trouble before. Clean record. Just a one-time bad decision. So the defense puts DUI on the stand. The whole idea is to humanize them in front of the jury, show remorse, talk about how rough life was at the time, explain how they've learned from their mistake, and it's working. The jury seems to be buying it. Then the plaintiff's attorney gets up for cross and asks him, "Earlier, you testified that this was your first and only mistake. Is that correct?" The DUI replies, "Yes. Isn't it true that you were previously convicted of DUI in another state?" The PA questions. Silence. Defense counsel jumps up with an objection denied. Papeth then proceeds to machine gun their way through the prior conviction, which, oh by the way, involved the death of a child. The courtroom goes dead silent. The jury is visibly horrified. The defense attorney looks like they want to crawl under the table. The PA again asks, "Do you remember the name of the little child you offed while driving intoxicated?" At that point, it didn't matter what DUI said. That question sealed the entire case. The jury was done, everyone in the room was done, and that is why you never ever lie to your attorney. Story 21. A friend of mine leased a house in his name and lived there with two buddies, total party house vibes. After about 6 months, he met a girl and decided to move out and live with her. He didn't bother changing the lease, but the other guys promised they'd keep paying rent and take care of the place. Fast forward one by one, those guys move out, new occupants move in, who have zero connection to my friend, who's still on the lease. Eventually, rent stops coming in. The agent calls, saying eviction is coming. The new occupants throw a massive party and trash the place. Kitchen cupboards gone, some were even burned in a fire out back, doors ripped off hinges, walls full of holes you could walk through, gardens destroyed, total disaster. My friend calls me for help cleaning up before the inspection. When we walk through the place, it's beyond repair, basically a rebuild job inside. We go to the agent, who tells us the damage bill is about half the value of the house. They photocopy the lease, and we get a copy of the ID used to sign it. My friend's driver's license. Then we go to a lawyer friend. He looks it over, then bursts out laughing and says, "You were only 17 when you signed this. You can't legally sign a lease until you're 18. We tell the agent, they freak out, but there's nothing they can do. They even had to return the bond because they weren't legally allowed to take it in the first place. Story 22. I had a client, a big guy, who had been abused by his much smaller wife throughout their marriage. After they divorced, she started taking her anger out on their son. One day, the kid ran away to live with his dad, and we filed to limit her parenting time and change custody permanently. At the hearing, she denied ever being abusive to either the kid or my client, said she never threatened anyone, and claimed she never spoke badly about my client in front of their son. What she didn't know, and hadn't told her lawyer, was that my client had recorded multiple instances of her abusing him. So I called my client back to testify again, and played a recording of her yelling at him, threatening him, and calling him names, all while the kid could be heard begging her to stop in the background. The other lawyer just buried her face in her hands. We won the case. Story 23. This isn't my story, but it happened to my sister a couple of years ago. Some background: she had a daughter in college with a guy from our reservation. Our family didn't like him because he came from a pretty troubled family, and honestly, she deserved better. She was working and going to school full-time, while he just sold weed and didn't contribute much. After they had the baby, he wanted to spend more time with his son from a previous relationship, I guess, so the kids could know each other. The problem was, he didn't have any income, so my sister was paying for these trips using her scholarship refunds. It was a financial burden, but she never asked us for help. One day, she ran away from home with their daughter. It came out that their 3-4 year relationship had been full of domestic abuse, drug use, and manipulation. Looking back, the signs were obvious, but it was a shock at the time. The next few weeks were all about moving her out and dealing with crazy drama from the baby daddy. They went to court to sort things out. He had lost custody of his other kid and didn't want to lose custody again. My sister didn't want him anywhere near her or their child. We kept wondering why he lost custody before, probably due to his drug problems and lack of financial stability. My sister got temporary full custody, and there was another court meeting to establish his visitation rights. She wasn't happy about it, but was hopeful to get full custody eventually. At the court meeting, he showed up late, which wasn't unusual, but when he did arrive, you could smell alcohol on his breath. He argued with the judge because he thought the meeting was about custody, not visitation. Then he threw a chair at the judge. Guards tackled and restrained him. Turns out he had a couple of warrants out for his arrest, so they took him away. After that, my sister got full custody, and we haven't heard from him since. The best part is that, at the previous court meeting, he told the judge he had no problems with alcohol or anger issues. Story 24. I was handling a simple bond hearing for a bad check case, felony level $5,000. The main job was to convince the judge that my client would show up for his next court date. I'd just been hired the night before by his panicked wife, so I didn't get to talk with him until right before the hearing. That morning, I asked if he'd ever been in trouble before. He had some minor past charges. All resolved, he was in his 40s and claimed to be clean. So far, so good. I asked him, "Have you ever failed to appear in court before?" After a short pause, the client replied, "Way back in college, I missed one court date." I was concerned and asked, "Are you sure?" "Yes," the client said. Feeling confident, I presented my case to the judge, explaining that the one missed court date was just a youthful mistake and that my client now took court seriously. The judge then asked me, "So this failure to appear was just because he was an irresponsible college student?" And I replied, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge then starts scrolling through the records and asks again, "Can you explain the other 9 failures to appear on his record?" My heart starts sinking. I looked at my client, who was somehow still calm. I said, "I think he's in a better position to explain those." Long story short, the judge wasn't thrilled. My client got a bond but had to borrow way more money than expected. Don't lie to your attorney. Story 25. Not a lawyer, but I served on a jury once where a guy was suing a big grocery store chain, claimed he slipped on some water in front of a freezer and couldn't work for 3 years due to the injury. During the trial, the defense attorney calmly asked, "Sir, isn't it true that you spent 18 of those months in prison for armed robbery?" We were all stunned. He had video footage from his wife showing him lying in the water, but you could clearly hear her telling him to splash it so the water would show up better on camera. On top of that, it came out that he had 3 prior convictions for what the court called crimes of dishonesty, things like shoplifting and fraud. Oh, and did I mention he was representing himself? He also tried to submit his own messerais as evidence without any expert to interpret them, just wanted to show them to us jurors and explain them himself. The defense tore into him with questions about 2 prior knee injuries he'd conveniently left out, and when he asked how they even knew about that, he found out his former lawyer had already handed over his medical records. Story 26. Back when I was a law student, I interned for a judge, and one of the cases we were observing was an illegal lockout dispute. The plaintiff owned a franchise location for an international cafe chain, and the defendant was both his landlord and the person with rights to issue franchises in the U.S. One day, the landlord just locked the guy out. He claimed the franchise owner was selling unauthorized merchandise, specifically some rogue coffee cups printed with the company's logo. For 2 straight days, the case focused almost entirely on these mysterious cups. Finally, the landlord takes the stand. The defense attorney dramatically pulls out a shopping bag, presumably the cups. We're all leaning forward, and then the landlord suddenly can't remember where the cups even came from. First he says he got them at the cafe, then he switches it up and claims corporate gave them to him. Just like that, the chain of custody was shot. The judge refused to admit the cups into evidence due to the conflicting testimony. The defense attorney looked crushed as he quietly slipped the bag back into his briefcase. So yeah, lesson learned. Prepare your freaking witnesses, especially when you're trying to introduce critical evidence. Story 27. Years ago, I had a client charged with drunk in public, a minor infraction, but he was on probation, so he needed to fight it. He told me he was pretty drunk that night, but had made it to the lobby of his brother's apartment, waiting for him to come down and get him upstairs. I took that info and ran with it, bringing photos of the apartment complex and its bylaws to court. My whole argument was that the lobby was a secured area for residents and guests only, so technically he wasn't in public. Since there's no formal discovery for minor infractions where I practice, and no real plea deals on something this small, I didn't discuss the case with the arresting officer beforehand. I wanted to surprise him with my argument. But then the officer testified that he found my client at a completely different apartment building on the other side of the city, outside at the call box, barely able to stand and rambling. I whispered to my client about the mix-up, and he slumped over saying something like, "Sorry, I meant to go to my brother's place. Maybe that's why the officer couldn't find me. And why did he sound angry on the phone?" Cross-examining the officer didn't help much, just asking if he was sure about the location. My closing argument that my client wasn't that drunk didn't get anywhere either. In the end, a guilty verdict, a minor fine, wasted time and resources, and some light probation sanctions. Story 28. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a manager involved in a pretty unfair dismissal situation. One of my shift supervisors caught a call center employee making personal phone calls during work hours against company policy. We checked phone records and saw he'd called the same number over a dozen times in a week. It was a number for a private service, nothing related to work. I called him in with witnesses, explained the situation, and was ready to issue an official warning for violating the phone policy. When I asked if he recognized the number, he lost it, yelled, kicked a chair, shouted he quit, and stormed out, cursing loudly. 2 days later, he showed up with a lawyer demanding to meet the general manager. His lawyer wanted big compensation, demanded I be fired immediately, and threatened criminal charges against me for hate crimes because he claimed I fired the employee for being gay. The GM asked me for my side. I showed the signed company policy, call records, the warning letter I prepared, and statements from witnesses confirming that the employee quit. He wasn't fired. I made it clear that the calls themselves or his sexuality were never the issue, only the company policy violation. The lawyer took a few deep breaths, apologized for wasting everyone's time, especially to me for the baseless threats, and walked out, dragging the client behind him. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from a different call center asking for a reference for this guy. Story 29. A while back, I was on trial for domestic violence charges filed by my now ex-wife. She claimed I had thrown white paint on my own car and then beat her up. But the real story was way different. We were arguing, and she was destroying my stuff, throwing it out the window. I told her I was done, and that's when she started throwing rocks at my car. She even tried to pick up a rock the size of my head to smash the windshield. When that was too heavy, she grabbed a gallon paint can to throw at the car. As she tried to throw the paint can, I stopped her and tossed it aside. Then she attacked me with an ice scraper. At that point, I restrained her and sat on her until she calmed down. Once she did, I let her go, but she ran to the spilled paint, covered her hands in it, and threw it all over my car before going back inside. I went to the door to get my stuff and leave. She tried to kick me in the sacks, but I caught her foot and told her to chill. She pulled her foot free but hit it on the door frame, getting a small cut and bruise. After I left, she called the cops, claiming I'd beaten her up. At trial, I defended myself. She told her story about me attacking her and throwing paint on my car. Then my lawyer pulled out photos of my black car covered in white paint and asked if I'd thrown it on myself. She said yes. Then he showed the police photos of her injuries, but in the pictures, her hands were covered in white paint like gloves. Also, it came out that she was cheating, which was why we were arguing in the first place. The jury acquitted me, and the jury foreperson even told me in the elevator afterward, "We decided to let you go because you need a divorce." Story 30. I had clients who insisted the bank had wrongfully foreclosed on their house. The wife provided bank statements from a different bank than their mortgage lender, showing they'd made payments every single month for years. I went through every statement carefully. All looked legit. Plus, there was proof they never actually received the foreclosure notice. The bank was pretty confused. Experts told us that during the recession, some banks' record-keeping went off the rails, so wrongful foreclosures happened. We went to mediation, but the bank's first move was to claim they spotted a tiny error in the bank statements. So they canceled mediation and subpoenaed statements from the bank itself to compare. Our clients and we were annoyed. So what if there was a small mistake? When we got the bank statements back, I started comparing them to our clients' versions. That's when I noticed something weird in the electronic withdrawals section. It looked like our client had edited their statements, deleting an entry, adding the mortgage payment, and adjusting the totals every month. We confronted them, saying, "These look forged. You can drop the case or explain what's going on." The wife said, "We should probably drop it." She never admitted to us directly, but it was obvious. The husband had no clue. He wasn't even on the call when we brought it up. A few weeks later, he called asking for an update, and telling him his wife had lied to him for over a year was brutal. The bank said they'd be okay, dropping the case as long as our clients paid their attorney fees. Our clients agreed. Honestly, it was lucky the bank didn't push for criminal charges. Story 31. Not a lawyer, but I was volunteering at a community advice center that offered help with housing and legal questions. One day a man came in with what sounded like a heartbreaking story. He said he had been unfairly evicted from his council flat and was now homeless. For context, council flats in the UK are low-rent apartments provided by the local government, and they're notoriously hard to get. Waiting lists are often years long, unless you're in a really desperate situation. According to him, he had to leave the country temporarily due to a family emergency, but claimed he kept paying the rent the entire time. He said he asked another family to check in on the flat while he was away. Then one day, the council showed up, saw the other family inside, and decided that he had violated the tenancy terms. He said they called him and told him he was being evicted, and that was that. His English wasn't great, and he said people were throwing around confusing terms like leasehold and freehold, which just made everything worse. I was genuinely moved and kind of furious on his behalf. Here was someone who had a crisis, tried to do the responsible thing, and was now being punished for it. So I picked up the phone and called the housing office, thinking I'd help advocate for him. That's when the housing officer calmly explained what had happened. The man had walked into a commercial letting agency, claimed he owned the council flat, and then rented it out to a completely unsuspecting family for 6 months and at 4 times the rent he paid. That family got blindsided and had to find somewhere new to live ASAP. What he did wasn't just against his tenancy agreement. It was borderline fraud, and apparently the only reason he wasn't facing criminal charges was because the council had decided not to involve the police. I just sat there kind of stunned and more than a little embarrassed. I still have no idea why he came to the advice center with a made-up story when it was so obviously going to fall apart. Story 32. I once got approached by an attorney who wanted me to work for him for free to help go after smugglers. The idea sounded compelling at first. This guy had been arrested for dumping goods in the US in violation of trade agreements, and in the process, a bunch of merchandise belonging to his clients got left to rot in warehouses. Those clients had never been paid. The attorney showed me receipts, invoices, and even a court order setting aside $2 million from the criminal penalties to pay off those debts. He just needed help bringing the case to trial and promised to pay on contingency once the verdict came in. He already had 2 other attorneys working with him under the same deal. I helped out briefly but ended up moving on to other things. Those other 2 stayed on the case for over 2 years. At one point, they negotiated a $1.5 million settlement, but the lead attorney turned it down because he was convinced he could get double that at trial. The case ended up settling for $200K because none of the actual clients were willing to enter the US to testify. They were afraid they'd be arrested. The 2 attorneys who stuck it out walked away with just $8K each for 2 years of work. Story 33. I wasn't a lawyer yet, just a law clerk at the time. It was a pretty standard divorce proceeding, and this particular jury trial was focused entirely on dividing marital property. We're talking a 5-day ordeal with both sides presenting evidence, bringing in expert witnesses like land assessors and financial planners, and making all the dramatic arguments you'd expect in a drawn-out court battle. Right before closing arguments, the attorneys asked to approach the bench for a private conversation with the judge. Turns out, a couple of days earlier, The couple had decided to get back together and just never told anyone. Not the judge, not their lawyers, not anyone involved in the trial. They figured it wasn't important enough to mention. Cue one of the attorneys asking to be dismissed from the case on the spot and walking out of the courtroom. The judge had to dismiss the jury after 4 full days of wasted proceedings. The couple genuinely didn't understand why their reconciliation was relevant. Story 34. I primarily represent plaintiffs in personal injury cases. And oh man, I've seen some truly head-in-hands moments. The first one was in a road traffic accident case. Everything pointed to it being clear-cut. My client had been cut off when the defendant suddenly decided to exit the motorway without warning. Solid liability, or so we thought. Then the defendant takes the stand and testifies that right after the accident, my client's passenger told him something along the lines of, "She wasn't looking." Naturally, we're thinking, great, a supposed admission from our side. So the passenger, my client's friend, who is Polish and has been living in the UK for over a decade, is called to testify. When asked if he made that statement, he flatly responds, in English, "I don't speak English, so I couldn't have said that." Then there was this employment discrimination case. It hinged entirely on whether our client was fired due to a genuine redundancy, legal, or as retaliation for announcing her pregnancy and requesting maternity leave, very much illegal. We emphasized the importance of this distinction with the client over and over again. She was rigid. They didn't give a reason. They just let her go right after the maternity leave discussion. The night before the hearing, we're prepping her. We go over the defense's likely argument that she was told it was due to redundancy and ask her how she plans to respond. She casually says, "Oh yeah, that's exactly what they told me." You'd be amazed how many people show up at our office wanting to sue over a serious injury and genuinely can't remember when it happened. Not like missing the specific date. They can't even recall if it was last weekend or the one before. If something is significant enough to pursue legal action over, you'd think it would stand out on the calendar. Story 35. There's this rule in trial work: never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. But sometimes, lawyers throw in small, obvious questions just to set the scene. Questions where the answers seem like a given. This case was the exact opposite. The defendant was arrested on a warrant and taken to jail. After booking him in, the arresting officer went back to his patrol car and found a bag of drugs right in the middle of the back seat. The defendant was charged with possession. At trial, the officer explained he always searches his vehicle before shifts and after transporting anyone in the back seat. The defense tried to poke holes, but the officer's story was super consistent. The timing of the appearance of the drug lined up perfectly with the defendant's ride. Then the defense attorney ran out of questions and asked him on a whim, "Was anyone else in the back seat?" Usually, police don't transport more than one person at a time, so everyone assumed the answer was no. But then the officer said, "Yes." Turns out, the defendant was arrested with his girlfriend, and the officer had dropped her off at her apartment before taking the defendant to jail. This wasn't in the police report, the prosecutor didn't know, and the defendant never told his own lawyer. Since someone else had been in the back seat, there was enough reasonable doubt. The prosecutor basically gave up, and the defendant was found not guilty. After this, I learned never to assume any fact in court, no matter how obvious it seems. Story 36. I was involved in a due diligence process when my company was about to buy a small tech startup. The COO was a popular guy, friendly and outgoing, but there were rumors he got a bit too hands-on with some female employees. A woman in sales had filed HR complaints and hired a lawyer, so there was talk of a walkaway package for the COO to keep part of his bonus despite the accusations. I sat in on the meeting where the company's lawyers grilled the COO about his interactions with this woman. He insisted he never had contact with her at work, unless others were around, and those people said nothing seemed off. When asked about any contact outside work, he flat out denied it every time, no matter how they asked. Later we met with the woman and her lawyer. The COO wasn't there. Her lawyer showed us a pretty explicit card that came with a bouquet of flowers from the COO. Turns out the COO had a florist account linked to his credit card. When confronted, the COO responded, "But I never had contact with her. It's not like I delivered the flowers myself." Yeah, right? Needless to say, the COO got fired for cause, no bonus, and the woman got PTO until after the acquisition, and then moved to another company under our umbrella. Story 37. Back when I was a law student, I interned for a public defender between my 2L and 3L years. I had a limited license, which meant I could do some basic court appearances, like arraignments, as long as my supervising attorney was present. Great hands-on experience, and I was excited to take part in actual cases. One morning we were meeting with a client before his arraignment. He openly admitted to the charge and said he didn't want to fight it. He just really wanted help with his drug problem. My supervising attorney told him he'd be a great fit for the drug court program. But the first step, he explained, would be to plead not guilty so we could get an agreement in place with the prosecutor. I sat and watched as my supervisor carefully laid out the entire process. The client seemed to follow everything, responded appropriately, and appeared sober and cooperative. Eventually, my supervisor asked if it would be okay for me, the intern, to represent him for the arraignment, just a basic not guilty plea. The client agreed. I was pumped, my first small courtroom moment. So we went into court. I sat next to the client, everything's going smoothly. I entered the plea. Then the judge, as part of the routine, asks the client, "Sir, do you have any questions for the court?" And the man, after that whole detailed explanation we gave, turns to the judge and says, "Can I just confess now?" The judge gave me this look, not angry, just deeply pitying, and gently said, "Sir, I think you need to consult with your counsel." At that moment, my supervising attorney walked up, tapped me on the shoulder, and just said, "I'll take it from here." I slinked back behind the bar like a shamed puppy. My supervisor wrapped things up, the plea went forward as planned, and the client got on track for drug court. Later, my supervisor told me that functional addicts often become skilled at sounding like they understand, even when they don't. That day, I learned that a calm demeanor doesn't always equal comprehension. Story 38. Not a lawyer, but I'm a paralegal working in personal injury, mostly motor vehicle accidents. I had this one client who got into a car accident in March. She had a pretty complicated medical history, so we were ready for a fight with the insurance company over causation. The attorney was already over her because she kept calling ambulances and going to the ER. And for those who don't know, just checking into an ER in NC can cost over $1,100. Even the crappier E.Rs charge that much just to show up. When the client finished treatment, we gathered all her medical records to send to the insurance company. That's when we found out she'd been in a second accident 2 months later, in May, with basically the same exact injuries as the first one. So we had almost a year's worth of treatment, but the insurance company only wanted to cover the 2 months after the second accident. On top of that, the EMS records showed she called ambulances 8 times, but EMS said only 2 of those calls were legit. The other 6 times they arrived and found no real issues at all. It quickly became a total mess. The client didn't even see a problem with it since she was already getting treatment. And despite us calling her every few weeks to check, she never bothered to mention any of this to me. Story 39. I'm not a lawyer, but I had to deal with a nightmare situation that dragged on for nearly 2 years. It involved my nephew and his mother, who had a really bad history of abuse toward him. After countless efforts trying to help her and keep the family intact, Child Services finally stepped in and told her they were going to remove him from her care. She lost it, told the social worker off, and then called us, saying she was done, that she wanted us to take custody of her son. We agreed. She came over, signed over guardianship and custody in front of a notary, and our nephew moved in with us. She disappeared from his life and went her own way. For almost 3 years, things were calm and stable. Then out of nowhere, she filed to get him back and to cut us out of his life completely. Her entire case was based on some wild story that she had never abused him, that Child Services was never involved, and that we had kidnapped our nephew and bribed the notary to forge the guardianship papers. Shockingly, her lawyer bought into this narrative. Her lawyer requested all child welfare records for our nephew and my sister-in-law, expecting nothing damaging. Instead, the judge received a massive file full of detailed records of child welfare involvement, starting when the kid was just 6 months old, right up until the removal at age 6. The records also clearly documented that she voluntarily surrendered her parental rights to us. There was even stuff in there that I had no idea about. Coincidentally, my sister-in-law didn't show up for court after that and stopped communicating with her lawyer. The trial wrapped up the very next day. We ended up with an even stronger custody order, plus the judge awarded us court costs and a large chunk of our lawyer fees. The judge ordered that my sister-in-law had to pay all court costs before she could even file against us again. The whole ordeal was awful and stressful, but in the end it gave our nephew a stable and safe life. Things are finally better for all of us. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.